Hey everyone, let's quickly talk about server actions and how they're going to replace your API route. So we'll walk through a simple example here. So I'm on the to-dos page, and these days in Next.js, you can have these server components. And in those server components, you can mark them as async. And then in there, you can use await, and you can actually fetch data. Right? So I'm using Prisma here as my ORM for my database. You don't need to know the inner workings of Prisma. So here you can see I have two to-dos in my database. They each have an ID, and they also have content. So walk, dog, outside, study for exam, right? So this is in my database. And in this line here, in my React component, without using useEffect, I'm just fetching this data, right? And then what I'm doing here on the page, I have an H1, I have a form, right? H1 and a form. And then I want to output it right here. So here we have that list and I'm mapping over those to-dos, right? So I'm taking each to-do and I have an li. I'm using the ID for the key, and then I'm using the content for the actual text that you see here. All right, so that's what we can do in server components these days. All right, so pretty cool that this is possible these days, but there's one thing even cooler, which is that we can also mutate data, meaning we can add a to-do with server actions. So how would that work? All right, so in the past, if I would type a to-do here, and I want to add this to our list here, in the past, what you had to do in React, here we have our form. I collapsed it, now I can open it. So here we have that input, and then we have this add button. If you remember in the past, you had to do some kind of on click for button, or for the form we could have on submit, right? So we could say on submit, and then we could just call that handle submit, right? And then we could deal with that here, right? We would do something like this, event.prevent default. We would get the value from the input. If that's a controlled input, you know, you had use state, right? And then you would use the state value. You could of course also use event.target. You would do some kind of fetch call, right? So you would do something like API to-dos, method post, body stringify, blah, 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 headers, right? Headers, right? So you would do something like this. So you have some kind of API route that then on the back end, you needed to make sure that you actually had that API route. And then you had to hook that up with, you know, some controller, some actual function that you want to run, right? So maybe if you were using Next.js, you could do that with, you know, with the API folder, and then you could create some route handler, right? Or maybe you were using, you know, axios.post, right? You were using axios, same story. You still had that API route that you had to create and wire up with the actual code that you want to run, right? And now we're getting an error here, by the way, because I'm trying to add this handle submit to this form here, but we're in a server component, and it's telling us we cannot add these event handlers because server components are meant to be non-interactive, right? So we would have to convert this to a client component. Now we don't need to do all of this. So we don't need to convert this to a client component. We don't need to create this whole API route and wire it up with the function that we actually want to run when this form gets submitted. We can use server actions. So let me remove this and save here again, and let me remove this as well. All right, so these days what we can do, if I now click add here, and we want to add that to our database here, what we can do is we can use the action attribute. You're going to hear the word action more and more in the world of React and Next.js. The idea here is that you want to do something. An action is just a function that we want to run. So here we want to add a to-do. So we could call that add to-do. And now we can create that function somewhere. Now you can, in a server component, you can actually just create it here. So just like that handle submit function, we can also just write that here if we want. Copilot is suggesting us async event. So Copilot is not completely up to date, right? So Copilot has been trained on a lot of GitHub data. So this is a very typical pattern. But these days, this is a bit new. So sometimes you have to correct Copilot here. So here what we're going to get is form data. I'm using TypeScript here. It's going to be of type form data. We can write it like this, right? And then here at the top of the function here, I'm going to say use server. So this function will only run on the server. So then if I want to get, I need to grab the input, the actual input here. I gave this input a name of content, and that's already in the form data, right? So here I don't have to use state or anything like that, right? Or like e.target. We already get the form data right here if you use this action attribute like this, right? With this is already the server action, right? So the server action is, right? So this function is going to be the server action. You can grab the input values like this. You have grabbed the input values, but now, you know, typically you would send it to some API route. Well, not anymore. We can do it right here. We don't need to create this whole API route. We can do it right here. I can use this Prisma variable right here. So I can say prisma.todo.create, right? This is how you can add something with Prisma, right? Prisma doesn't really matter here. It could be anything. Maybe you're using Mongoose, for example. I got started with Mongoose, but now I'm using Prisma here, right? Server action is just a function that will only run on the server, right? And also typically will invalidate. We'll talk about that in a second. So here I'm getting a warning from TypeScript because form data entry or null. So basically what we need to do here for Prisma is we need to pass a string here. This content needs to be a string. TypeScript is telling us that this could also be null. So here we know it's not going to be null because I put required here, but TypeScript doesn't know that. It says, yeah, it could technically be null. This content here, we can write as a string. So we can assert basically that this will always be a string. Right, so let's do that. Right, so this is what we can do now. So if we save this, now if we do this, I'm going to get an error here because you need to mark it in your next config file. You need to opt into this. So here in next config, I need to say experimental server actions true. If you're using this, make sure you do this in your next config file. As of recording, this is still necessary, but you know, if you're watching this in a year from now, probably not. I'm gonna save here. Now I've noticed that whenever I change my next config file, that my dev server crashes. Yeah, so here it crashes again. So I need to manually restart it here, npm run dev. Okay, so it's running again. Let me refresh here. All right, so now the error is gone. So let's go back here. The form has been changed now to run this action, the add to do action when the form gets submitted. So let's try that now. So now let's say cook dinner. Now I'm going to click add and this action should get invoked. So I'm going to click add here. And before I click add here, let me also add await here. Right, so this is asynchronous. So I'm going to await this. So now I'm going to save here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to click on add. So let's see what happens. So now I'm going to click add here and we don't see anything happening. This data here is still the old data. So we haven't invalidated this as it's called. Right, so here this action should now have been invoked. So this code now should have been run. So this Prisma code here now should have created some entry into our database now. So if I go back to our database here and I refresh my database, let's see if we see an extra item, and indeed we do. Right, so you can see now we have content cook dinner in our database now. So the database is correct now, but now of course we need to make sure that the UI is also correct. And this UI is still working with these to-dos that were fetched when we first loaded the page. We need to invalidate this as it's called. We basically want to tell Next.js this is invalid now, get the latest data. Right, so basically we want to run this again, this line of code again. And we can do that. We can say revalidate this path. Right, I can import it from next cache and I can tell Next.js this path that we are on /to-dos, right, which is where we were fetching this is now invalid. Right, so after we added it, the current data is invalid, so it needs to be revalidated. Right, so it needs to be refetched. Right, so let's add this and then let's try this again. And actually when I save the file, it actually already adds this for me. But let's try again another entry here. Let's say I need to do the dishes. So now I'm gonna click add here and let's see what happens. And that can take some time. Yeah, and now after like 2 seconds or so, it also adds this automatically, right? So it's going to take 1 or 2 seconds before this is finished, right? We're awaiting that here. So it could take 1 or 2 seconds and then it gets to this revalidatePath line, which will refetch the data here, right? So first it's going to add it to the database. Once it's in the database, we revalidate the data, meaning it's going to find all of the entries in the database again, right? So to-dos, and it will just map over those to-dos again, over all of them, right? And if I refresh, I can see that the database will be up to date, right? So now you can see there's another entry here, do the dishes. So database is up to date, UI is up to date, and we haven't even created some, /API. So how is this possible actually? Because it looks so strange because, if you're used to React, you're working on the front end and here we're sort of interacting with a database all of a sudden. So this looks very strange, but let's take a look at the dev tools so you can see that there is actually still communication between client and server, but it's handled by Next.js, right? So we are not manually creating an API route. Behind the scenes, Next.js sort of is doing that. So let's see here, I can go to network and here it's the network tab, right? So we can see all the network requests. So here, if I type something, if I just type test, let's type test here. If I click add here, you can see there is a fetch call actually, right? So there is something going from client to server here. If I click there, you can see there is something going here to the server. And this is not really interesting, but if we look at payload, for example, we can see that there is some form data going from client to server. So we can see one_content, basically the name of our input field is content, and we can see the actual value test. And then there is also some action ID. This is not done by us, this is done by Next.js, right? And some other stuff here. So probably some identifiers that Next.js uses under the hood to, match up this server function or server action with what we're doing here in this form, right? So we don't have to manually create these API routes anymore. Next.js does that for us automatically, right? So that's one of the benefits. You don't have to create these API routes anymore. And another benefit is that this will work even without JavaScript enabled. enabled. So if the user turned off their JavaScript, or the JavaScript hasn't loaded yet, or the JavaScript for whatever reason fails to load on the page, this will still work. It's also called progressive enhancement. And it also means that the client-side bundle will be smaller because you don't need a JavaScript. So the JavaScript doesn't need to be included in that client-side bundle. Another benefit is here, this function runs on the server. So we can update our database and then immediately revalidate. So in the past, on an API route, you would update your database, right, and then go to the client again, and then the client had to make another network call to get the latest data. Here we're doing both of that in one network call, right? So it will go from the client to the server, update the database, and then immediately revalidate the data here, right? So this is a pretty powerful combination. We can fetch data like this, and then we can update our data like this, server mutations as it's called. So together, you could even make the argument that this is going to replace React Query or maybe SWR if in case you were using that. I'll have a separate video on that. Make sure you subscribe. All right, now in practice, what you also want to do is, for example, reset the form, right? And you also want to show like a loading indicator, because now if I click on add, we don't really get feedback that something is being submitted, right? So typically in the real world, you do want to have some client-side interactivity here. We also want to validate the inputs from the user here on the client, for example, and on the server as well, but also on the client, right? So if we look at our component here, this is a server component. This H1 can stay on the server, right? But then here with the form, if I collapse this, typically we want to do some validation before we actually invoke the server action. We want to maybe also reset the form. So we want to use some client-side interactivity. So let's refactor this form into its own component, and mark that as a client component. So I will go here into components. Let's call that just form. Quickly create form component. I will just copy everything from here, pasting it here. And then instead of writing this here, we now want to have our form, right? Let's import this, right? So now we have this, and we want to have some interactivity here on the client, like reset form, etc. So we're going to make this a client component. So I'm going to mark this as use client. And now it's interesting because now, of course, we need to add this add to do server action, but now it's a client component. So here we were using, this is a server component. So in a server component, you can have this function here, right here in the component, and you can mark it as use server like this. You cannot do that in a client component, right? So if you want to use a server action like this in a client component, put it somewhere else and then import it in here. So what you're going to have in your project is you're going to have some actions folder. Let's see if I can add an actions folder here. Yeah, so actions, and maybe you can even create a file per action, but let's just create one, actions.ts, and I'm going to paste our action server action here. Server action needs access to our Prisma variable. We can just import that, revalidatePath as well. Okay, so now let's remove this. To recap here, our to-dos page is still a server component. It can still fetch data and map over that here. But now we have a form component, which is a client component, and I have separate videos on client and server components. Make sure you check out my other videos. In this client component now, we can import that action that we have a separate file, right? And what we can do is, instead of having this use server for every action, what we need to do here is we need to put use server at the top of the file. So every function that you export from here, export this function, will be a server action, right? So now if we export it like this, we have use server at the top. Now we can import that, right? I can import it like this. And this is a client component. So you can invoke a server action from a client component, no problem. So now if I save here, you can see the errors are gone. So this should work again. So let's quickly test it. Let's test 5. I'm gonna click add here and let's see if that works. And yeah, eventually it test 5, it still works, right? So we have successfully refactored this to a client component, this form, because what we want to do in the real world is we want to give some feedback while it's being submitted, right? We want to reset the form. We maybe want to do some validation here on the client. So typically you're not going to invoke your server action like this. What you're going to do is typically you're going to have a function in here actually, and we saw that already. We were already depending on that form data. We already got that here, right? So we get form when you write a function. You can now in Next.js applications you can write a function here for the action attribute. This doesn't work outside Next.js, right? So here you immediately get form data like this, right? So in HTML you pass like a URL to action, and the browser would submit form data to that URL, right? So Next.js and also Remix, they're trying to replicate that. So here what you can pass is a function. You immediately get access to the form data, and then in here you can still call that server action, right? So that server action, let's just pass the form data to that server action, form data. We want to make this an asynchronous function, so async, and then we're going to await server action, right? So what we can do is before we invoke the server action, we may just want to reset the form. So to reset the form, it's not a controlled component here. So what we can do instead is we can use useRef. So I'll quickly create a ref for the form is use ref, and this is going to be for TypeScript. This will be a HTML form element. So now we can use ref on the form. I'll just add that here actually. Ref is ref. Okay, so now what we can do is before we invoke the server action here on the client, we can say ref.current.reset. Reset this input. Now we're gonna get a warning from TypeScript because ref.current could be null. We actually initialize it as null. Call reset on null. So we want to have a question mark here, optional chaining here that we get rid of that error here. And then after it's reset, we're going to invoke the server action. A bit complicated here. I'm going to save here. It's already structured a little bit better, but bear with me. Right, so all the code here will be on the client here. So if we add input validation and other things, first run in the browser. And only when we call this function will this form actually get submitted to this function here, and this will run on the server. I'm going to save here, and I will just write test number 9. Add here, let's see what happens. Immediately it's cleared, and after a couple seconds, it indeed gets added to list here, so everything still works. We now also have some client-side interactivity here, or some client-side features, so we can make this a little bit more like real-world scenario, right? So you can do other things in here as well. By the way, the downside of using a server action in a client component is that you lose a lot of that progressive enhancement. So now, right, so that's one of the downsides of using it like this. Now, in the real world, you don't really have a choice. You do need that, client-side validation sometimes. You want to reset things. I think in the vast majority of cases, you're gonna have that server action being invoked in a client component. All right, now typically we also want to show like a pending state. So while it's being submitted, that it can show something like adding to do ... So we actually have a very cool hook that we also get in conjunction with the concept of server actions. We get some will be useful for this. Unfortunately, to make that work, you do need to make that a client component of the form. So you need to do that. The form needs to be an ancestor essentially. So what we're going to do is we're going to refactor this button into its own component. So I'm quickly going to create a button component. I'm going to copy this, remove it from here, just paste it right here. Or actually, let me create this, paste it right here. So we have a button. Here, we're now going to have a button, and I will import that. Right, so it works the exact same. If I save here, it looks the exact same, works the exact same, but now this button is its own component. And the hook that we can use here, formStatus. And this is still experimental. So here, if you import this, it's going to be this with this experimental underscore. Now we don't want to refer to it like that. So we can alias this. So we can say as useFormStatus. So here I'm going to remove this. So we can call this, and this will give us, well, let's actually see what we get. So here we can destructure these 4 things. So we can say we want to have action. This will actually show us the function, the actual action that is the server action that's connected to that form. Some data, the form data, the method. And what you most of the time want is this pending value. So now it will show you this form is being submitted. It will show you that it's pending. And so here we can use that variable here to display something in case that's true, in case it's pending. So here we have pending. Well, if it's pending, but we don't want to say loading, we want to say adding to do ... Otherwise, it should still be okay. So now if I save here, and let's try doing this again. So I'm going to code an app. So now I'm going to click add here. Let's see what happens. And you can see the button immediately changes to adding to do. It does show code app at the end of the list. There's a bit of a lag there at the end. I'm not sure why that is actually. Some of this is still experimental, so it doesn't work perfect yet. But this is what we want essentially. So this will not work if you do it here, right? So it needs to be that the form needs to be like an ancestor. This is most of what we want with forms, right? So we have like a loading state. You have some client-side validation, resetting the form. There's one other thing that in the real world that you also want, which is error handling. So what if this database call in our server action, what if that goes wrong? This is running on the server, right? So how do we make sure that if it goes wrong, that we can output some message to the client, to the user? This is its own separate topic, so I'll create a separate video about that. But just to give you a quick sneak peek, we can just wrap this in try catch. Right, so we can attempt to update our database. If this doesn't work and some error is thrown, we can catch the error, right? We can just catch that. And then here, what you can do, you can simply return that to the client. So you can just return, let's say, an object with error. That's going to be this E, right? So you can just return something in this function, and that will automatically get sent back to the client. So let's see where we invoke this server action in the form here. Here, where we invoke this server action, now we may get back, so we can just an object with error, right? So we we can immediately destructure that, right? So here we can just immediately get back an error. And if there is an error, so if error, we can just output, alert or maybe a toast message. But here we'll say, right, I have error.message here, right? So this would be a quick example, right? So here you would just catch the error, right? And just return something to the client, just like any other function. Destructure it like that. You can check if there is an error, we can alert or do a toast message. Now it's a bigger topic, so I'll create a separate video on that, right? So I'm just going to remove this for now, but that's just an example of another like real world element that you do need, right? So you do need to be able to deal with errors. So I remove it here for now. This is just a simple example. All right, so also let me clear the database here just so we don't run off the page here. So I'm just going to remove some of these to-dos. All right, so just removed some to-dos here, so we now have 3 left. So there's another very cool hook with this, and this will also be the future of UI, so we need to know how it works, and it's called useOptimistic. So here, these to-dos right now, they are always fetched here. So these to-dos are always coming from the database. Add a to-do here. We know that most of the time this will be successful, so we might as well just immediately add this here. We don't want to wait those 2 or 3 seconds before it has been added to the database and then it has been fetched again. Ideally, we can just immediately add this here, and if for whatever reason something went wrong, we just revert, we remove it again, right? But most of the time it's going to work. All right, so this is called optimistic UI. So to make that work, we're going to add this list also here to that form. Those need to be in the same component here. So let's just add that here. I will add the list here, and we need to React element here, not to. So we need to wrap this in a React fragment, right? Don't use div. No reason to add div. You're just gonna pollute the HTML for no good reason. All right, so then it says to-dos is not defined. So here to this form, and the form is not really a good name for this component anymore. So let me quickly rename this to, I will just call that to-dos component. Click yes, and this will now be to-dos component, import this properly. All right, so a bit of refactoring here. That's the real world as well. All right, so what we have now is still our server component, still the page. This page is still fetching this data, and now we have this to-dos component, which is a client component, which holds everything else, right? Including here this form with the action here. So now here we also have this list where we're mapping over all the to-dos. So we need to pass the to-dos here from the server to the client. We can just do that with props, pass it like this. So now this to-dos component will take in, so we can say to-dos, and I'm using TypeScript here, so let me quickly type this, to-dos component. So I'm using type here. I have another video on this. Don't use interface, use type. To-dos component props. Now it's actually going to be an array of to-dos, so let's type a to-do. It's just an object with an ID, and actually ID is a number. ID is a number and content is a string, and then we can just say this is going to be an array of that. So the props themselves, there's an object. What we're going to get is to-dos, which is an array of these to-dos. Don't worry if you don't know TypeScript, it's not really important here. But what we have now is we get these to-dos now, so we can map over them, right? They're fetched on the page. We're mapping over that here, right? So now if I add one, it still works. So test 3, I click 3 here, I click add here, and we see that everything is still working, right? So it still works. All right, now you could see though that it takes some time before it's actually displayed here. And in the real world, a really nice UI pattern is when you are optimistic, so you immediately want to show this. You immediately want to add that to the list here. And we can do that with another really cool hook that will also work really nice in conjunction with these server actions, right? So this is all connected to server actions. So what the hook is optimistic, so use optimistic, and this is also experimental at the time of recording. It's going to have this ugly name, so let's alias this, then we can just use it like that. Optimistic. Okay, we need to pass 2 things here. So the initial to-dos, it's going to be a function. It's going to look a little bit complicated, but this function will it will give us the state, the current state, and then also the new to-do that we will pass. And this function, this is called the reducer pattern. So maybe you've seen this before. You see it in Redux, for example, as well. So what we simply want to do is we take the state, we just spread it in a new array, and then we just want to add the new to-do here as well. So what we get here is 2 things. We get the optimistic, so basically the optimistic version of all the to-dos, and then also we can an optimistic to-do. Okay, so syntax here is a bit ugly. Let's see. But saying that new to-do is of type, and we can just say this is going to be of type to-do. I have a separate video on the unknown type in TypeScript. All right, so now this is a bunch of code, but basically what we get with this use optimistic is now instead of using the to-dos, the server, we want to have a more optimistic version of that. So that's what we get here, optimistic to-do. So now we don't want to map over the traditional, we want to map over the optimistic to-dos. So now if I save here, we look at the page, you can see nothing has changed. But now what we want to do is before we actually add it to our database and before before we have to wait those 2-3 seconds, we can already optimistically add it to the list here. And that's what we can do with add optimistic to do. So here if we call add optimistic to do, well, a to do is an object and has an ID, and we'll just use a random math.random ID here. And then the content is going to be the same as before, right? So from the input, and then we'll assert that it's going to be a string. And so now before we make that round trip to the server, we're already going to assume that it's going to be successful. So it will be added here. At least that's the idea here. So now if I save here and now we try adding this, I will write cool test here. And now I'm going to click add here, and you can see it immediately gets added here to the list. If I check the database, it should still be added there as well. Yeah, so in the database, it has also been correct. Right, so that's really cool, I think. Now we don't want to have that button anymore, show the pending state like that, you know, get some kind of loading state when it already has. So now we can just uncomment this and just always use. Now, one reason to use pending here as well is to disable this button. So here we want to disable the button when it's pending, right? Now we don't want to have this pending state like that anymore. We still want to use it for disabled here, but we just want to show, this is a really nice UI pattern, right? So it feels very snappy to the user if you have this in your apps. So if I have another test 5, if I click add again, you can see it immediately gets added here. Super snappy to the user, really nice pattern. All right, now what happens, because we're optimistic now, but what happens if something goes wrong on the server and we don't actually save it to the server? So then it should be removed again, it should be reverted. It's one of the benefits of using it in conjunction with server actions, because if we go to our server action now, that's in this actions file. So here, if something goes wrong here, if I just wrap this and try catch, right? And I'll have a separate video on dealing with errors. I'll just leave that empty for now. But let's say something goes wrong here. I'm using formData.content, right? But let's say I'm using, right? So I'm just make a typo here. Let's say I get an issue with TypeScript. I'm just going to ignore that. Just an example of something going wrong in this server action. So now we are optimistic and we think it's going to work all right. But now in the action, it's going to be wrong, right? So it's not going to be properly added to the database now. But on the UI, it's still going to be shown. So so we need to make sure that when it fails, that it's actually removed again from the UI. So let's try that again. It's going to be the final test that we do. So I will say final test. I'm going to click add here. Initially it's added now, you can see. And let's see, and you can see it automatically is removed, right? So you can see now, this is super powerful with these server actions. Not only, you know, don't we have to create these API routes, but you also get these hooks, these add optimistic hook, useFormStatus, you know, for the pending state. All right, so very quickly, you can use these server actions with this action attribute on the form. That's what we've done, but you can also add that. You can also do this with some other element in the form. So you can also use formAction, so not action, but formAction on the button, for example, or even an input. Right, so here they show an example. You could have an image upload. You can have a server action that will run when that occurs. Right, you don't need to create a whole API route, you know, /API upload image. Next.js will handle that for you under the hood. You can just this specific server action only to this input, right? So this is mostly useful if you want to have different server actions for different inputs, or you have 2 buttons, you want to have one server action for one button and then another one for the other button. Now you can actually also invoke server actions outside forms, and they recommend to use this use transition hook, but you don't seem to need this. You can even call this without the use transition hook from React. This looks very complicated, so you have this start transition. This use transition hook is actually used to deprioritize state updates, so it's a bit confusing that now it's being used in conjunction with these server actions. But from looking around, you don't need to use this hook. There's a benefit probably that comes with this, right? But this will completely disable the out-of-the-box progressive enhancement. But then you can use it with outside forms, right? And here they also mention custom invocation without that start transition, right? So without the use transition hook, it's also still possible. But if you're really interested in that, it's already pretty advanced. So then I would just recommend you go through the docs. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Now I have my React and Next.js course coming up soon. Highly recommend you get on the email list so you'll be notified when I release it. And if the video was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe with the notifications on. Check out my other videos, and then I hope to see you soon.